Well, pandemics have always posed a threat to cities, but time and again, we've seen some of the most innovative improvements to city life emerge in their aftermath. Bloomberg New Economy Forum looks at how the world can look to previous pandemics for clues as to how our post-COVID-19 world is already evolving.
Humanity has faced the challenge of deadly disease for thousands of years. And whenever a new pandemic takes hold, civilizations adapt in response. In the 19th century, cholera epidemics in Europe set off an outcry for investment in modern sanitation and urban renewal. The movement sparked Baron Haussmann's transformation of Paris into the City of Light, trading crowded slums for wide, tree-lined boulevards and monuments lit by gas lamps. Haussmann's modernization prompted cities all over the world to follow suit. London added sewage systems, and New York built Central Park, adding a reservoir and green space for city dwellers to take in fresh air. At the turn of the 20th century, tuberculosis swept through the US, creating a greater need for urban parks and bringing light and air into building designs. The 1918 flu pandemic led to the invention of the radiator, with steam heating systems designed to allow windows to be left open, even during winter months, for improved ventilation. COVID-19 has already intensified a push by cities around the world to reduce pollution by adding bike lanes, pedestrian walkways, and implementing building design changes. Paris is pioneering the idea of a 15-minute city, creating walkable communities of shops, schools, and clinics, reducing the necessity of cars or public transport. In the distant past, it took decades for pandemics to leave their mark on our city's urban design and architectural landscape. Well, the changes sparked by this COVID-19 are already taking shape.
Well, a lot to think about. And our next panel examines how cities are already reinventing themselves for the post-pandemic era. Our speakers are Lord Mayor Hazel of Dublin, Ireland, Edward Glaeser, Professor of Economics at Harvard University, Liang, Chairman of Vanke, Lord Foster, President of the Norman Foster Foundation and founder and Executive Chairman, Foster & Partners, and our moderator will be Reuben Abraham, Chief Executive Officer, IDFC Institute. Reuben.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in to this from. Welcome to the City of Lights panel. Just quickly to explain the format, we'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A between me and the panelists, followed by an audience Q&A. So if you have questions, please type it out as the session goes on. There's also a polling question that is being presented to you right now, which you'll have the chance to take. And then at the end of the first part of this program, we will actually see what the respondents have basically said to the polling questions. So with that, I think the organizers have teed it up really well for us with that video that we just saw. So let's jump straight in. We've got very limited time. Brevity is key. So let me just, Ed, let me come to you first. We just saw that video. The last however many months, 6 months, all we've basically heard is, obviously cities have borne the brunt of the COVID pandemic. And so therefore, there's been a lot of talk about how, basically the time of cities is over and so on and so forth. But as we saw in that video, that just is not true because this has happened in the past. Do you want to throw a little bit more color to this whole story of pandemics and cities and what we can learn from the past?
I would love to, Reuben. And the truth is that cities and pandemics have a very long history together. They've co-evolved in a sense. If you think back to Athens 2,400 years ago, 2,500 years ago, it's hard to imagine a city that achieved more amazing things. It created history as we know it. It created democracy. It created unbelievable art, philosophy. It really created a new vision of human creativity. But of course, it also created a plague. The backstory for that was, of course, that Pericles had summoned the Athenians inside the city walls to protect them against Spartan foot soldiers and sent out the Athenian navy to harass the Peloponnesian coast. The problem was that while the walls were perfectly effective against hoplites, they were completely ineffective against bacteria, which came into Athens and really doomed Pericles' dreams of victory. 900 years later, Justinian's Constantinople, an attempt to reimpose the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world. Once again, right, the dreams were toppled. But for the past 650 years, right, cities have been much more resilient against plague, right? For 200 years after the Black Death, urban civilization flourished in the Renaissance. The recurrent pandemics that hit cities throughout the world in the 19th century, yellow fever, then cholera, tuberculosis, as was said, these were opportunities for cities to invest, to reinvent themselves. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water and sanitation in 1900 as the national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army, right? Cities have a remarkable amount of resilience, and we have had a blessed century in which we have not, in fact, featured major pandemics, but we will get through this again, just as we did in the 19th century. And I just want to make one final point on this, which is in some sense, the most important thing that we did in the 19th century was to actually figure out how disease worked. It was John Snow understanding the waterborne nature of cholera. And that really is the lesson going forward, that knowledge is the most important thing that cities create, and it is the most important weapon that we have against pandemic.
Norman, if I can come to you for a second. There's a quote that I found from you, from a speech that you'd given earlier, which is you said, if you want to look far ahead, then first look far back. So do you broadly agree with what Ed said in terms of what we can expect from our cities post-COVID? Or do you expect some changes post-COVID?
No, I totally agree with Ed. The story of pandemics, the story of history, the way in which the city comes back stronger, revitalized, energized, transformed, improved infrastructure. So in part, this idea that you learn from the past, you learn from history, I think is as relevant today as it's ever been. I guess the point is that this pandemic will seem in its aftermath as though it's changed everything. With the perspective of time, of history, it will be seen that it's just magnifying and accelerating trends that were already apparent before the pandemic. Perhaps the thing that is new is the attitude of mind. Some of the things in terms of transformations which might have had a long battle, a long series of debates, would now be much easier to achieve. Pedestrianisation of cities, greening of cities, for example, as more space is given over to pedestrians, to citizens.
So both of you are fairly positive about the future of cities post-COVID. Let me just come to Hazel, because Hazel, you actually run a city, and obviously Dublin has been affected. And one of the things that you've kind of proposed is this idea of, I mean, this has also been widely discussed around the world, this idea of a 15-minute city. Do you want to just explain that a little bit? I mean, so if you can also address what Norman and Ed addressed, which is, do you have the same kind of positive view for Dublin post-COVID? And if you can just also briefly explain the idea of the 15-minute city for our viewers.
I totally agree with Norman and Ed. I think this is what humanity is. You have to have faith. You have to understand that in every crisis, there is also an opportunity. And I loathe saying that because there has been so much mourning and so much loss and so much grief. But there is an opportunity there, and you can see it time and time again when we saw it at the offset of this broadcast, the different cities that thrived and took that opportunity and ran with it. And you can see it even now during the pandemic. You look at Lithuania, and Vilnius is the capital that has transformed it's transformed into an open air restaurant almost across their city. It has social distancing, cinemas outdoors. It has wide pedestrianisation across the board. And you see that also in Athens and Milan. For us in Dublin, why I am so keen on a 15-minute city, because we are rolling out what we call COVID mobility measures to protect people, to have safe spaces and safe transport routes for them for cycling and walking. But why I want 15-minute city is the same reason Paris does, is because you need that sense of community as well. Time and time again, we've seen through this pandemic is that community is essential. So in Dublin City alone, what it used to be what I call a donut. So in the centre was this amazing filling, and everything else in the periphery wasn't really looked at, but the centre was. Whereas now it's an inverted donut. It's the donut with a ring and a hole in the center, where everything is now empty in the city center and everything's gone to the periphery. So what we need to do, however, is spread it. Insofar, the city center and also to periphery needs to have this connection, and things need to be within 15 minutes of a community to work, because we've seen that 15-minute city plans do work. If you have schools, if you have work, if you have shops within that 15 minutes, people travel to it well. It's more sustainable, it's more environmentally friendly, but ultimately what it does well is it builds community, which is what is the lasting thing that we should take out of this pandemic, is that community about the whole nature of all in it together.
So in effect, what you're saying is whether you live in the core or the periphery. So let me rephrase that. Are you saying that we need to have less of the periphery to core commutes? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, what I'm saying is that donut example I talked about becomes this massive, all over spread of love, shall we say, a perfect donut where every bit is good, because you don't have to then just commute to the center. You don't have to go to the periphery just to benefit either. Every pocket is better urbanly planned so that it becomes a community for each village or town, so that it works better in terms of the system.
So let me just pick up on this, and I'll either you can answer or I'll go to Ed with this, which is, so what do you see as the future of public transit? Because one of the things that has been absolutely hammered during this crisis is public transport. So if you look at any transit system around the world, they're all in trouble, right? So I mean, do you see people coming back to public transit? I mean, what is the future of public transit going to look like? A, post-COVID, and B, if we actually get to a 15-minute city. I know Norman wants to come in as well. I'll come to you. But, what do you see as the future of public transit?
I see that we need more of it, and that's when people would actually take it more, because like every city, as you said, public transit has been decimated, but it's also that fear from people. They don't want to be overcrowded. They don't want the possibility of getting infection, so they don't go for public transport. But that means that you have to have more frequency and you have to have a better service, and things will go back to a new normality as well. If you look, for example, of SARS after Hong Kong after SARS, the public transport was decimated for a period of a good 6 months afterwards. It was only when people realized there's a new normality back, that they became more, I guess, relaxed about taking public transport.
Ed, if I could come to you on this, do you foresee yourself taking the New York subway or the Boston T at 4 p.m. anytime soon?
Anytime soon? Well, I think we're likely to wait until a vaccine, or at least a cure for that. In some sense, this hints at the great tragedy of disease for cities. That ultimately, one of the greatest things about cities is their ability to enhance human sharing. Right? What is an urban restaurant but a shared kitchen, a shared dining room? What is an urban park but a shared backyard? And of course, public transportation is a great example of human beings sharing engines, sharing chassis, sharing tunnels. And they're what makes cities in part so functional and so humane, because they are at the heart of urban collaboration. But they don't work if people are terrified of being next to one another. And I think it really emphasizes the fact that we're going to need to fix the disease before we can actually really trust the public transit to get back. So we've really got to hope that we fix this vaccine, and that we manage to make the investments that we really need to make sure that this is a one-off pandemic, that this doesn't happen again anytime soon.
But in effect, what you're saying is people will eventually come back to the transit systems.
They will. Memories are short. People will eventually come back, yes.
Okay. Norman, you wanted to come in on what Hazel was mentioning, and I know specifically you have a great interest in the whole idea of community, for instance. So over to you.
Well, this thing about looking far back to look ahead, the idea of the 15-minute city is not exactly new. I mean, I grew up as a child in Manchester, and there was the equivalent of the high street. Everything except one thing, which was the workplace, was within 15 minutes. But the workplace at that time was pretty dirty and was excluded somewhere else. Incidentally, in London, 90% of the population is within 15 minutes of a high street. So this is a vital and very important rediscovery. I think the importance of zoning to reinforce that, because industry is now clean. It can coexist. It can be within walking distance, close proximity. All of this is about the quality of the high-density city. And there's been enough studies now, scientific studies, to demonstrate that high density, proximity of people together in a city, that does not mean high infection rates. Quite the reverse. The highest infection rates were in some of the lowest density areas. The improvement in quality of public transport would be towards less density. In other words, if you can sit down rather than have to stand up, if you're not crammed together. So the higher quality public transport will be less dense. So I think that's another trend. And you can see that now in Asia, in Hong Kong. If you take the train out to the airport, it's a super luxurious train. You're not crammed, everybody, like sardines in a can.
So I want to return to this density question in a bit, but let's just switch over, because everything that we've discussed so far is mostly about the West and the developed West. So I would love to get a perspective from a developing country standpoint, but specifically China. So if I can come to you, Liang. So obviously China was hit by the first wave of COVID. It's one of the few countries since then where the situation has pretty much returned to normal. Yes, borders are closed, but I think by and large, things have returned to normal. Did Chinese cities change in the aftermath of the pandemic? And are there any trends that you've observed since a sort of return to normalcy?
Well, we do see some changes in Chinese cities since the pandemic, but I think that these changes were not caused by the pandemic. They were accelerated or intensified by the pandemic. I think one very obvious, prominent point is that we now have multi-centered, multi-tiered, and multi-node cities appearing now, and they're networked. And so their facilities are more complete, and there are more shared facilities. In the past, we already began to see this tendency of some cities. For instance, in Shiko, in Shenzhen, it slowly changed from a single-purpose industrial zone into a super complex one. And it has a free trade zone, a cruise port, an art center, a coastal leisure corridor. And then there's Lujiazui in Shanghai. It started off being designated to be a financial center with these relatively simple functions. But now it has many more functions. It has art galleries, pedestrian walk, and the place is full of vloggers and web influencers. And so the appearance of this pandemic has stepped up this appearance of multi-centered cities and distributed changes, because these network cities are more ecological, more livable, and they're more resilient. So now, after this post-pandemic, Chinese urban planning will be more resilient, and they will not be systemic collapse. And we can also see that in city planning, in policies, we want focus on resilience and networking among cities. And there are some very good examples of these. Like in Shenzhen, their park system and their greenway form a very good network. Within 500 meters, citizens can reach the park, and within 5 minutes of bike riding, they can enter the greenway. And 5 minutes drive will bring them into a green. Now, normally, this is a good place for sports, for leisure, for entertainment. But if there were to be a pandemic or disaster, this park network becomes a place for disaster prevention, for functions such as isolation and refuges and evacuation and disaster relief. I mentioned Lujiazhui just now. They have a terrace flood prevention coast. The lower section provides park functions, and it helps mitigate small rains, minor rains and floods. But the higher section can help mitigate major floods, even a once in a 1,000-year flood, and that increases the city's resilience.
Thank you. Ed, if I can come back to you for a second on the density question that Norman touched on as well. One of the things that I think people have conflated during this pandemic, certainly in the reportage that has come out, is exactly what Norman pointed to, which is, this is not necessarily, so if you look even at a place like New York, the place that is least affected in New York City is actually the least dense, which is Manhattan. So is it that people are basically conflating crowding and density?
I think that's right, that there's no problem with having tall towers and being safe. And as you say, certainly within New York City, within the 5 boroughs, the lowest case rates were in downtown Manhattan. The lowest case rates were in the inner portions of Brooklyn. Now, that's partially because the people there were able to switch to telecommuting. They were able to reduce their number of trips. It's really about contact with strangers, not about density. So I don't think we should be frightened of height going forward. We just need to make sure we have protocols in place, science in place to make sure that density doesn't lead towards excessive connection between people who aren't able to protect themselves against the spread of a virus.
Norman, coming to you for a second. So one of the things that, now the bit that we saw in the beginning about, for instance, radiators in New York City and so on. So one of the things that we know certainly with respiratory illness is the requirement for ventilation. And the fact that indoor transmission is a big problem with COVID. And it looks like that is a problem with any sort of respiratory illness. Keeping that in mind, is there sort of a new paradigm within the architectural system that we need to basically think about that actually accommodates for the fact that we need more ventilation, indoor transmission is a problem at times of pandemics and so on?
There have been a lot of studies about healthier buildings, and over many decades, we've pioneered healthier buildings. And the reasoning has been subjective, but those subjective values have now been proven by studies like the Harvard School of Public Health that green buildings are actually proven to improve your concentration, your response to crises, your ability to absorb information. And the kind of buildings we're talking about, interestingly, Bloomberg's own headquarters or the recent Apple headquarters, these are buildings which have a large element of natural ventilation. So the climate is controlled, but the number of air changes is probably 2.5 times that of the traditional sealed air-conditioned box, which is recirculating refrigerated air. So the inclusion of nature, whether that's greenery, whether it's the ventilation, I think the move towards healthier buildings, which has been pioneered by a combination of designers with enlightened individuals who commission, who care about their workforce, that has been a fringe. That, I think, is more likely to be mainstream.
Hazel, I know that a couple of things that you really care about are around both integration as well as inclusion. So how do we sort of, I'm going to combine this with a really good question that came in from the audience, which is that the 15-minute city is a worthy goal, but how do we ensure that it doesn't become just a luxury for wealthy urban residents, but it also serves poorer residents a great deal more? The audience questioner has actually asked my question in a much better form. So if you could just respond to the whole sort of, how do we make sure that this is inclusionary?
Well, this is the thing. We talk about diversity true and true these days because of the various movements that have happened and happening, like Black Lives Matter, and we talk about the importance of fighting discrimination. But there's a huge difference between having a diversity and having an inclusive city. And your other guests, Ed, Norman, and Liang, all talked about density there, and how in a way density is not bad, especially when it comes to the pandemic. I would like to then dive that into another layer and say that yes, absolutely, density isn't the issue, but what is issue is a class system, and also the divide when it comes to the lack of integration when it comes to some communities, because you will see it in Ireland here that the poorer communities, the ones that have factories that have migrants working in it, those are the areas that have high infection rates so far. So to have a proper plan for the next pandemic, if it was to be to happen, you need to have a proper integration strategy that will work for a 15-minute city. So as your questioner rightly asked, how do we prevent it from being a luxury where it just becomes this bubble for wealthy people who can avoid health issues and also have the luxuries of being near their city? The answer to that is a proper integration from grassroots level plan in a city. That's what we're doing. That's what I'm going to be chairing over the next couple of weeks. And it's something I've noticed because coming from a second generation immigrant background, my mom was an immigrant here from Hong Kong 40 odd years ago, and she would have stuck to what she calls her own. And it's like when we all go to cities, we will go spot what is closest to home and we will flock towards those people. That has to be broadened out. You need to have communities within these 15-minute city that values people's culture and where they call home, but also be able to integrate them into the wider community itself. So through a given village, I would want to see food shops from different ethnicity. I would want to make sure that education has built in with them different language and also different religion, because we share a lot of commonalities, but we also need to celebrate the differences we have and celebrate diversity. And that comes from the heart of the community. So a plan that is bottom up is what we need.
So let me ask you a follow-up. Let me ask you a quick follow-up on that, because globally, there's a enormous amount of sort of nativism and resentment that is bubbling over in many countries in the world, and cities are kind of a liberal bastion of liberal values, so to speak, which is partially what you're sort of hinting at. I mean, do you see that how do you see that playing out? I mean, because a lot of the political stuff that you see around the world is actually also a conflict between urban versus non-urban values, so to speak. Do you care to comment quickly on that?
So urban and non-urban, but also working class and upper middle class, and it's a class divide as well as an urban versus city divide. And to do that, what you need to start having within housing is a multi-layered housing system where you don't just put social housing or public housing, as we call it, in just one block, and then more luxurious housing in another block. You need to integrate, and you need to make sure that new housing that gets built has your affordable housing, has your cost rental, has also your social housing, all integrated into it. Because then in a way you're almost not giving people a choice. You're saying, listen, you may think your neighbor is different and of a different class system to you, but that doesn't mean they're not good people. And it means that you can share an environment. And the first step is to have them sharing a housing environment to move on to the next step.
Okay. Liang, if I can come to you for a second. I mean, so also, if you have any comments on what the speakers have already spoken, please feel free to comment on that as well. But just, I have a question for you, which is, did the pandemic also change the behavior of people in China? And if yes, how do those changes affect people? How do they affect communities? How do they affect buildings? And of course, how do they affect cities?
Indeed, the pandemic has changed people's lifestyles. And if so, we can see that people has focusing more on the immediate food, clothing, and shelter to a greater focus on long-term health. We have a higher health standard of the buildings. For instance, in the northeastern China, when we built the houses, we have found out that these northeastern parts of China has a high incidence rate of cancer, lung cancer. That's because people stayed a longer time indoor in a window. So we designed the heat HVAC systems for the buildings. The homeroom air was ventilated every 2 hours. That was not enough. We added air purification on the system and then heated the air. We hope to provide cleaner, fully ventilated, comfortable, fresh air to the buildings to ensure the health and good experience of the people living there. Actually, the community can play a very big role in pandemic control. The community can help the city government to control the pandemic in a smaller unit. Self-help and mutual help within the community can alleviate the burden of the city government. For example, in the equipment, we try to use the contact-free system and elevators to reduce the unnecessary contact in the neighborhood, lower the risk of transmission, and provide hassle-free passage to those find the system or elevator difficult to operate, such as elderly and children. We also, during the pandemic control, use a lot of smart equipment and a terminal. Lack of the products or for the seniors and the children, they are not very friendly to them. During the pandemic, we found that they are the ones need special care and protections during the pandemic. So during this process, for the society to be smart, we should take care who needs the most. In the future, we should let the city and community to serve better for the people. And I'm convinced that the city will defeat this virus and pandemic. Thank you.
Perfect. I'd like to ask the organizers to just keep the poll results ready while we go to the next. I'll call for it after this round of questions. So Ed, if I can just come back to you once again on this change of behavior. So the most obvious change of behavior for all of us is what we are doing right now, which is, we're working remotely. What are the implications of remote working for the future of cities? I mean, there was this famous book that was written in the late 90s by a former economist correspondent called The Death of Distance. I mean, is the death of distance truly upon us? What do you think about remote working?
So this prediction that the death of distance would kill off cities goes back 40 years, goes back to Alvin Toffler and the third wave. And for most of the past 40 years, he's looked completely wrong, right? In the sense that cities have become more vibrant, face-to-face contact has become more important in a world in which knowledge is more important. The technology industry has loved face-to-face connection. They've loved the idea of bringing a whole bunch of young people together and letting them create together, right? All of a sudden, we're now Zooming. And yet, there are reasons to think that this will not be the new normal. On the sort of pro side, we've done a series of polls of business leaders and business economists, and about 40% of businesses say that 40% or more of their workers who switched will stay switched. Moreover, among the workers who switched, many of them seem to have productivity levels that are not all that changed. On the con side, right, no one's hiring in remotable jobs. So while remotable jobs, employment stayed constant, non-remotable jobs, employment crashed. But non-remotable hiring has jumped back up. Remotable hiring is totally gone, which suggests that in some sense, we are coasting on skills, on connections that we made during a period of face-to-face working. Businesses are not hiring new people for these jobs. And in some sense, also, remember, for younger people, right, one part of working is the joy of being around other human beings, and we don't have that. Last point, if the future is remotable, it is a world that is unbelievably unequal, right? 70% of people with advanced degrees who are employed are now remotable. 5% of people who are high school dropouts are now remotable. This is not something that less skilled people would do. For most of the past 50 years, the one employment safe haven as automation destroyed and outsourcing destroyed factory jobs was the urban service sector, right? Was leisure, hospitality, retail, trade. 20% of American employment, 32 million American workers were in those jobs, and those jobs disappeared. This remotable future is not a future that works for less skilled Americans. And so it is absolutely vital that we make sure that the face-to-face world comes back, and as well it should, because it is a future that face-to-face world is a future that's built around humanity and built around the joy we all take from being around other human beings.
Norman, I'll come to you for the last word on this round, which is, again, just to build off this question of remote work. I mean, the sense of community that you care about so deeply, I mean, is that under threat from remote working?
Yes, I think it is. Or you can turn the thing on its head and say that at a certain point you have exhausted all the potential for the remote working, and you're dying to get back with colleagues in a face-to-face environment to do what you cannot really do in a Zooming environment. Now, I think that you'll see technological advances which will enhance the virtual reality of being together in cyberspace. But in the end, there is no, in my view, substitute for the communality, the social dimension, the same urge that brings people together in an urban restaurant rather than, eating at home. It's a question of balance, and I think you can only go so far with the work-at-home environment.
The moderator is never supposed to inject his opinions into these talks, but I think I broadly agree with both of you. But having said that, if I can just call on the organizers to give us the poll results. Okay, looks like 39% of the audience thinks that remote work is going to empty out urban centers. Commercial property prices, and more affordable cities usher in an urban renaissance. Okay, if we can just switch back, do any of you want to just comment on the poll results?
Well, if prices fall, then the properties won't remain empty. Right? So the normal thing that happens in commercial property markets is when there's a drop in demand, and I think there's no question that remote working is a drop in demand, what happens is that prices fall and newer, grittier businesses come in and take the space that has been emptied out. If you think about how much demand there was for downtowns pre-COVID, I have no doubt that will continue. It just may be slightly different businesses.
Okay. Hazel, please go ahead.
I would agree with Sorry, I would go ahead and say we've seen this in Dublin during the recession that happened in 2009. It kicked off in 2008-9, and by 2012, across the board, you had empty shops and empty commercial spaces that were there for months and years. Before then, they became pop-ups, and what then materialized were more creative, grittier, as I said, spaces that actually enterprise. That was great for the urban centers, great for the local communities, and it was also great for creativity. It actually brought an injection to new creativity into Dublin. So I would definitely say commercial prices dropping may not be a bad thing altogether.
Hazel, while I have you, let me also a question from the audience. Unfortunately, all the questions are anonymous, it looks like. This is a question, though, addressed to you. What needs to be done differently to adapt the 15-minute city model to smaller cities? Is it possible to leverage private sector investment in the same way?
Yes, in a way, but like Dublin's pretty small. We don't live in a big city at all. I used to live in New York, and whenever I came home to Dublin, it was like, oh, we're actually a lot smaller than I had thought. And the private sector investment, yes, in terms of certain spaces, I would say there is a opportunity there for when it comes to the tech space and when it comes to creating kind of tech hubs, and also in terms of funding and investing in what we call approved housing bodies to help with social housing, to help build with social housing. So there are certain spaces that I think private investment would be good, but I think across the board, it needs to be publicly funded. We need to raise funds because ultimately it comes back to what I said at the beginning, that your public investment means that you will have a better city that's controlled by the city council and its councillors and also general governance, that they will be more invested in the survival of it. So I think anything you turn to the tend to privatize will, in the long run, not benefit the community as well. And we've seen it here with municipal waste being the main example. So it's patterns you've seen in different cities, that once you privatize something, for the immediate short term, it's good, but then for the longer term, it's detrimental for the city.
Ed, do you broadly agree with that?
You know, I'm with Deng Xiaoping on this. I don't think I worry if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. I don't think that there's a right answer in terms of services being private or public. There are certainly times in which privatization has been an absolute disaster, and there are times in which privatization has led to cost savings and more efficacy. The work of Eduardo Engel is particularly good on public-private partnerships and when they work and when they don't. But the answer is just proceed with care and try and figure out whether or not a private entity is going to be an efficient producer or it's going to be an entity that's going to run away from quality and bribe the heck out of the city council. Both things have happened in history.
Okay, so I have one more question from Tracy Zhou from Jiangsu, China. And this is a question that any of you can address. So her question is, COVID-19 challenges the resilience of many cities, impacting the economy, healthcare, transportation, and more. How can we build a more resilient city? And how do we prioritize different aspects of resilience? Any of you who would like to take it?
I nominate Nan. He hasn't spoken in a while. Or Norman.
Anyone can take it. It's fine. I mean, Norman, do you have thoughts on this, on the resilience question?
I think it's a feedback from experience. This is not going to be the last health crisis. This is not going to be the last pandemic. There were very learned voices that warned everybody of the current pandemic ahead. So I think it's a learning curve to improve the infrastructure of response, of health, to take advantage of the changes, to make the city healthier, cleaner, quieter, to plant more trees which will absorb carbon dioxide, to recognize the response of the health sector, and to build more resilience, more capability, more capacity into those services.
So Reuben, if I could just add quickly.
Yeah,
so
please.
The sad
Quickly,
truth is, whereas in the 19th century, waterborne illnesses were crucial, and so cities could protect themselves by investing in sewers and piped water. Airborne illnesses really do require a different response. Ventilation helps, but really the critical actor in this is actually not the city, it's the federal government, it's the national governments, which spend so much on healthcare and ended up with this, right? And so we really need to have a much greater focus on communicable diseases. That means that we are protected in a way that makes sure this never happens. And that requires a combination of research, early warning systems, and technology.
Hazel, because you run a city, clearly, and I know you've probably likely thought about the resilience issue. I mean, do you have any quick thoughts to add before we turn to the last question?
Well, I'm slightly biased in where I'm going to steer this tangent to. I also chair the Green Party, who is a coalition party in government in Ireland. And for me, the pandemic is one thing, but the climate crisis is another. So for us as a community and across the world, you're going to have various crises coming up. So the resilience factor is as Norman was saying, in terms of prevention, building up capacity, but also understanding the research element that we need to start fighting this. We need to have certain things in place across the board, apart from just health, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of housing, in terms of environment. How do we protect our citizens across the board in every way? That's how I would look to build resilience right now.
Okay, we're out of audience questions, but I'm going to use moderator's prerogative to ask Ed one last question. Ed, if you can very quickly answer this. Why is there, so when you look at the history of pandemics, why is there a significant economic difference between various pandemics? So for instance, the Black Death actually turned out to be beneficial for the economy, whereas COVID has been a disaster for the economy. If you could just very quickly just touch on that.
Absolutely. In some sense, the whole global economy has hurtled in a way that has made us maximally vulnerable to an airborne pandemic, right? So in an age of subsistence agriculture, if a third of your population dies, what that means is that the remaining population have a lot more land per capita, and that means they get a lot richer. In the case of manufactured goods, yeah, the factories are vulnerable. But in fact, you can still sell the product, right? Especially with the move from wool to cotton in the late 18th and early 19th century. You could heat that cotton and make sure it wasn't carrying any bacteria with it. Now, in a world of urban service economies, where in fact, these particularly less skilled workers have found that selling a latte with a smile is a safe haven in a world of automation, right? That urban opportunity disappears when the smile turns into a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And so because we have become a face-to-face economy, we are at our most vulnerable point, which is why it's so crucial that we invest in a way that makes sure that this never happens again.
Perfect. So the good thing about technology is it makes us start on time and end on time. But the good news is we've got a really positive message that's come out of this panel, and I hope the world listens to it. Thank you very much to all my panelists for a great discussion.